This is Trevor Coates, and I am sharing my data overview of Osborne Middle School. Introduction and purpose. I'm going to examine demographic data for Osborne Middle School during a 3 year period from 2016 to 2019. I'm going to review student achievement data on the English language arts and mathematics milestones assessments for Osborne over that 3 year period as compared to student milestone scores in Gwinnett County Public Schools and the state of Georgia. I will also identify strengths and weaknesses in the current English language arts and mathematics instruction at Osborne. And finally, discuss next steps and make recommendations regarding English language arts and mathematics instructional practices at Osborne. Now, here are some questions to consider. What are the strengths and weaknesses of English language arts and mathematics instruction? What do teachers do when students master the content? What do teachers do if students do not master the content? What adjustments do teachers need to make to ensure that students are performing at the proficient and distinguished levels? How are culturally responsive teaching practices used to support the changing student demographic? What will we review in the data overview? We're going to look at student enrollment count, student demographic data, teacher data, the current LSPI or local school plan for improvement, the CCRPI data, the milestone data for students, and there will be a summary discussion on strengths, weaknesses, and next steps. I will begin with an overview of the school. This data will include graphs of student enrollment, a demographic profile of the student population, and teacher data. Next, we're going to look at our student enrollment data. Notice that our total student enrollment in the 3 year period has remained relatively consistent, ranging from the upper 1600s to about 1700 students on average. As we look at breaking down our student enrollment by race or ethnicity, the majority of our population has consistently and historically been white students. In 2016, we had about 62% of our student population white. And then you can see where the other racial groups come in. Looking at our racial breakdown from 2017, 2018, notice the shift. We're noticing that other demographic groups, ethnicities are increasing while our white population is beginning to decrease. And most recently, with the 2018-2019 school year, our student population is becoming even more diverse, with African American, Asian, and Hispanic populations continuing to grow. Next, let's look at our student demographic data as it relates to unique populations, specifically our special education students, ESOL students, and students receiving free and reduced lunch. If you notice, over time, the 3 year period, using the key at the top to denote each time frame, our special education population in percent is remaining about the same, about 15%. Our ESOL population is beginning to grow um, from 2% to 6% over time. And our free and reduced lunch population is staying about the same, around 20% consistently over those 3 years. Next, let's look at our teacher certification levels. Over the 3 year period, Osborne is seeing an increase of teachers who are earning higher degrees, of teachers with master's and specialist degrees. A few staff members do have doctorate degrees as well. As we look at years of service for our teachers, we'll notice that many are in the 16 to 20 year period in their careers. Most recently, with our 2017-18 data, we have teachers who are approaching that 21 to 25 years of experience range. As we get into our assessment data, it's important for us to look at our current local school plan for improvement, or LSPI. Notice our long term goal. Osborne Middle School will increase the percentage of students scoring in the proficient and distinguished ranges on the milestone assessments, specifically in ELA and mathematics. Let's start by looking at our CCRPI scores. If you notice, historically, over the 3 year period, Osborne Middle School has outperformed students in Gwinnett County Public Schools, which is noted in red, and students in the state of Georgia. All right, let's look at our milestone data for language arts and mathematics. Here I've created a graph for all three grade levels, 6th, 7th, and 8th. Notice that Osborne Middle School over the 3 year period is outperforming students on the math and English milestones for each grade. I'm going to transition to our 2017-18 data. The same is observable. Our 18-19 data, the same is true as well. Now let's look at our ELA performance data by student group. This data represents student performance for 2016-2017. Notice the large bands of students who are performing in the proficient and distinguished levels for each of our student groups. I'm bringing that to the surface because those two performance bands are the focus for our school's local school plan for improvement. Our students with special needs have smaller bands of proficient and distinguished learners performing in those areas. So, those are some points that we need to work on. Let's look at our 2017-18 ELA data. Notice the same is true. Here's our 18-19 student data. Over time, here's our math data. Over time, the graphs, for the most part, are changing by very small amounts. So students at Osborne Middle School are performing pretty solidly in the proficient and distinguished levels. However, we do need to take a close look at our student groups, our African American, Hispanic populations, along with our students with disabilities, our English language learners, and our economically disadvantaged students, where those proficient bands in yellow and distinguished bands are much smaller in comparison to the other student groups. For the final phase of the data overview, let's look at how Osborne students performed by grade. Pay attention to how the graphs increase in the proficient and distinguished levels for students over time. This is sixth grade English milestone, seventh grade. Both sixth and seventh grade had a really over half of those students perform consistently in the proficient level, and then another 20% in this distinguished level for both sixth and seventh grade. Eighth grade ELA performed equally as well. Here's the data for sixth grade math, seventh grade math. Look at this striking increase in seventh grade distinguished learners that is to be noted. However, for eighth grade math, the number of students performing proficiently and on the distinguished levels shows a sharp decline. As we wrap up our conversation on our data overview, let's begin to summarize with our strengths. So, according to our CCRPI score, it can be said that Osborne Middle School is performing consistently higher than other Gwinnett County and state schools. Students at Osborne Middle School are consistently outperforming other students in the district and the state in English language arts and math on the milestones assessments for all three grade levels as well. Diversity in the school student population is increasing every year. Sixth and seventh grade students perform consistently on the proficient and distinguished levels in ELA and in math. Now let's look at our summary of weaknesses. The percent of students performing at each achievement level has remained about the same for each of the student groups over the 3-year period. Eighth grade marks the largest decrease in students performing on the proficient and distinguished levels in math. Over half of students with disabilities and limited English proficiency performed in the lower performance levels of beginning or developing learners. And the greater percent of African American students performed lower than other racial and or ethnic student groups. Let's look at our next steps and recommendations. We're going to review and share these data results with each content area PLC cohort planning team. All eighth grade students should not be placed in algebra. Instead, let's look at how we're placing students in math classes that are developmentally appropriate for them. We need to train our staff on instructional strategies and digital resources to support the needs of students with disabilities and our English language learners because our populations for ELL students is growing. We see that in the data. So we need to be ready to provide those students with what they need to be successful in the learning environment. We need to provide opportunities for sixth and eighth grade teachers to share best practices with eighth grade ELA and math teachers, since those two grade levels, those students performed pretty well, much better than eighth grade. So we need to look at what are our sixth and seventh grade teachers doing to ensure that their students are successful on these assessments. And finally, OMS teachers need to be trained on culturally responsive practices and relationship building to ensure the diverse student population is considered in the learning process. This is the end of my data review. Thank you very much.